intensive journal program is about a way of investigating your own life narrative to find what it is about your life that needs your personal attention. It is a highly innovative process. It's a writing process. People sometimes mistake it for a therapy. In fact, it is therapeutic. One of the ironies that Dr. Progoff talked about often is that this recovery work or this restoration work or this spiritual centering work is very, very intimate. The irony being you cannot do it alone. So the intensive journal program has always been focused on individuals working privately and safely in small groups, facilitated by guys like me who have the certification and the experience to enable people to do this very intimate writing. So the writing itself is done in 4 separate workshops, but it's the first 2 that really amount to your entry into what Dr. Progoff calls a time-stretching experience. The psychology behind this innovative program was developed by Ira Progoff in consultation, actually, with Carl Gustav Jung, very famous psychologist that we all know that name, and in collaboration with 2 other fellows. All 4 of them began to develop this new understanding of how the psyche works. They were moving away from the Freudian model of diagnostics and analysis of the psyche, treating the psyche as though we're a wounded part of the human organism. So they came forward with this idea that the psyche really has a historic quality, it has a creative quality, and it has a healing capacity, but must be stimulated. Dr. Progoff referred to this often as making the intangible part of our life tangible. So a part of this process was to think in terms of the psyche as having this creative capacity. Dr. Progoff did his PhD on Carl Jung and studied with him in the 1950s before he began to develop this writing. He was a psychotherapist in New York and did his work individually with persons who had an interest in finding some way through what he called a transition of their life. Perhaps a divorce or a death in the family or some major incident in their life that began to diminish their sense of self and self-worth. So he worked individually for a number of years before he discovered that as he gave writing assignments to some of the folks who came to him for help, the people who were doing the writing were getting better faster than the people who weren't. So what happened in the early 1960s is Dr. Progoff began to develop this writing method. He saw that there were certain aspects of a person's life that, if given private attention in their own journal workbooks, and then the opportunity to bring it into a group session to speak about it on reflection, it had a wonderful quality that people were able to revisit parts of their life that may have arrived at this point in time as shameful or fearful or just plain scary, in the sense of, I can't speak about this with anyone, even my therapist. As time went by, then Dr. Progoff devised these 2 introductory workshops, the first one called Life Context, and the second one called Depth Contact. Each of them begins now to ask people to write with writing prompts about what he called logs about your life, that there's a life history log. We want you to begin identifying, first of all, what's going on in your life right now. In the last 2 years, how would you describe where your life is now? And then that would expand into what was called the life history log, because what we call that time of your life now is a period log. And so we were looking for 8 other periods. Well, the second workshop then is the second part of the innovation for how the psyche operates. Dr. Progoff added what he called this non-cognitive element. Instead of just people analyzing the pieces of their life, we asked them to begin entering the non-cognitive pieces of your life, your dreams, your hopes, your intuition, your emotions that all have impacted you. And so began to redefine trauma. In fact, Dr. Progoff never used the word trauma. We use it a lot now. But what he was defining, what we now call trauma, were simply life transitions, pieces of my life through which I need to now move and begin finding a new grounding for who I am. So I call this the recovery of personal agency. That as I go through a variety of experiences in my life, and I have been going through them since the day I was born, I've survived most of them. But then as we move through early childhood, infancy and early childhood, and approached adolescence, other experiences began to shape our life. And if they were serious enough and debilitating in some senses, we began to seek help. We looked to psychotherapists, or perhaps our pastor, or our imam, or a priest, or our rabbi for help. How do I begin to redefine who I am, perhaps in religious terms or spiritual terms, cultural, community terms? What I find very unique about Progoff's process is the meaning dimension. That often is not when we are either in AA or Alcoholics Anonymous, or in Narcotics Anonymous, or even nonviolent communication workshops. We talk a lot about the experience we have had without the opportunity to reflect on what meaning does that have for me. So the writing opens up this channel for people to not only revisit pieces of their life that they would not normally have in social conversation or even in therapeutic conversation, because of the privacy of it. People begin to get the idea that I don't have to talk about this, but it is important that I do acknowledge that I put this on paper. I need to take it out of my heart. I need to take it out of my tummy and put it on the paper that this happened to me, or this is now happening to me, and this is how I feel about it. All writing is done by hand. It's a direct connection to the soma experience of your body as you write. We often do our writing from our head. We believe that it's a mental problem, and we have to fix it with better thinking and clearer rationality and reasoning. When the reality is, we know now from a variety of sources, very modern, even psychiatric sources, are becoming aware that the experience you are writing about has a somatic component. It's a combination, actually. It's emotional, it's physical, and it's spiritual. The lived experience you have doesn't live in your brain. It lives in your whole body. And we often take a few minutes to explain how the vagus nerve plays a role in that. Whenever, especially traumatic experience happens, your body has to absorb it. It's not your brain that feels sad or angry or lonely. Your whole body feels it. The other aspect of this writing that is highly innovative and extremely important is the safety. Because as we know, sometimes we revisit those pieces of our life And suddenly all those feelings flood back. We find ourselves in a sense of loss and grief or shame, and what to do with it. Well, in the writing workshop, the first thing we ask you to do about it is just write it down. You don't have to tell anybody. In fact, in my own journal work, there's pieces of my life that I still haven't told anybody. But I have found great solace in just having written them down. The third piece that's quite innovative here is the reason we work in groups is what's called the concept of peer support. People are offered the opportunity to speak some of their truth to this group of peers, people who are in the same spiritual, emotional, psychological boat. So after each reading, there's no conversation. It sounds a little strange, and particularly for people who are accustomed to doing peer support groups where there's a lot of chatter in the group, where people with lived experience come to give advice to other people. That doesn't happen here. It's not so much about the advice as it is about what we call sacred space experience. That in this group, I can speak my most dark and fearful truths and not get any advice about it, not be scolded for it, not be analyzed about it, but find great spiritual resonance in just being able to say it aloud. That the psyche is actually a very creative component of your personality. And the diagnostic process doesn't necessarily help. All it does is identify symptoms. And so when we come into the workshop, we don't go down that road. There's no analysis, there's no judgment, there's no diagnosis, there's no pathologizing. It's simply an opportunity in a group of peers for me to speak my truth and find how it does in fact stimulate my creativity. So the last element I want to speak about here is what all of us are familiar with now is mindfulness. And often it's thought of, well, just being mindful in the present, being able to be present. And it's a wonderful aspect about it. One of the unique components of the intensive journal process is that we go back and you get to decide at what points of your life you want to revisit and be mindful in writing about that point of your life. Because it is in that writing that you begin to expand your self-understanding, you begin to see yourself in a larger context because you've survived that. And that creativity stimulates now as an encouragement, you will survive this as you are now doing in this intense journal process.